Everyone in Three Forks, Arizona said the same thing the morning Della Hartwell drove her wagon down from the burned-out claim on Bitter Mesa. She won't hold a week. They said it on the porch of the Mercantile, and they said it over the rail at the stock pens, and they said it loud enough that she heard it through the open window of the land office, where she had gone to do the one thing none of them had ever bothered to do. She had $11 folded into the seam of her glove, 2 children asleep in the wagon bed under a quilt their father had been buried in everything but, and a single rolled land record that the county clerk had handed back to 3 different ranchers across 2 years with a shrug and the same flat sentence: "There's nothing in it for you. Go home." She was 26 years old. Her husband had been dead 5 months. The fire that took their barn and most of their roof had come the same week the fever took him, and she had spent the spring sleeping under a wagon canvas with a boy of 7 and a girl of 4 and 1 milk cow named Pearl, who was the only thing on that mesa still giving anything back. People in town knew her face the way you know a stray dog's face. They nodded. They did not look long. And when she stepped down from the wagon in front of the land office that morning, with her flaxen braid coming loose at the temple and her late husband's vest buttoned over her work dress because she had nothing warmer, the men at the rail went quiet the way men go quiet when they have just been saying a thing they would not say to your face. Before I take you one step further into this, and I promise you, by the end of this, you are going to watch a woman everyone in that town had already written off, read one single line aloud in a crowded room, and take from 3 powerful ranches the only thing in 40 miles worth fighting over. Do me a small kindness. If you believe a quiet person who actually does the work can beat loud people who only ever talk about it, tap that like button so this story reaches the next person who needs to hear it today. Leave a comment and tell me the city or the town you're listening from right now, because I read them and I love knowing where in the world you're sitting while we go back to the high desert of 1884. That's it. Now come with me, because this is where it starts. Let me set you down in that street the way it was, because you ought to hear the mockery with your own ears before you watch it come apart. The wagon came down off the grade slow, the brakes squealing, Pearl the cow tied on behind and plodding with her head low. Three Forks at that hour was waking up. Smoke from the bakehouse, a man sweeping the boardwalk, the stock pens down at the end of the street, already loud with bawling cattle and the men who tended them. Della drove past the pens with her eyes straight ahead and her chin level, and she heard the voices start up the moment she was abreast of them, the way she had known she would. "Well, look who's still with us," one of them said. It was a sandy-haired puncher named Lon Briggs, leaning on the top rail with a coffee tin in his fist, and he said it to his fellows, but he pitched it to Carrie. "The Bitter Mesa widow. Thought the fire would have run her off by now. Where's she think she's going so early?" said another, an older hand they called Stub. "Land office, looks like," Briggs said. "Going to argue her back fee again, I'd wager, or beg an extension." He spat over the rail. "That Mesa's killed 3 families I can name. She's got 2 babies up there and 1 cow and not a man to swing an axe. I give her till the first hard frost. Somebody ought to do her a kindness and run her off now," said Stub. "Before the snow does it the hard way. A woman alone on Bitter Mesa, it ain't natural." "Ah, leave her be," Briggs said, grinning. "She's good for a laugh. Came in last week to argue That dry deed of hers like it was a deed to the bank in Prescott. Pruitt couldn't get rid of her. He raised his coffee tin in a little mock toast toward the wagon. There she goes, the landed lady of Bitter Mesa, off to read the county her rights. What's a widow want with rights? Stubbs said, when what she wants is a husband and a roof. I give her till Sunday. And they laughed, the easy laugh of men who have never once had to bury a husband and hold a county at bay with their 2 hands. Della did not turn her head. She had learned, in 5 months of this, that turning your head was how you lost. You kept your eyes on the road and your back straight, and you let them say it to the dust. But little Sam, riding up on the seat beside her, had heard every word, and she felt him go stiff, and she felt his small hand creep over and grip a fold of her skirt, and he said, in a low, fierce whisper, "I hate them, Mama." "No," she said quietly, not looking at him either, watching the road. "Don't waste it. Hate is heavy, and we've got a long way to carry our load today. Let them talk. Talking's free, and it's all they've got." She clucked to the team. "Watch now. We're going to do a thing this morning those men can't do, and they don't even know it can be done." "What thing?" "We're going to read," she said. The boy frowned, because that did not sound like much against men who laughed at you from a fence rail. But he held on to her skirt, and he watched the land office come up on the right, a low adobe and plank building with a faded sign, and he watched his mother set the brake and wrap the lines and climb down in her dead father's vest, and he did not know any more than the men at the pens knew that he was about to watch the most important morning of all their lives. The land office in Three Forks was a single low room with a stove that never drew right and a counter worn pale where men leaned their elbows to argue. Behind the counter sat a clerk named Mr. Alvin Pruitt, a narrow man with ink on his cuffs and a habit of saying no before he had finished hearing the question. He looked up when the bell over the door jangled, and when he saw who it was, the corner of his mouth did a small, tired thing. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said, "if it's about the back fee on the Mesa claim, the answer hasn't changed since Tuesday." "It isn't about the fee," Della said. She set the rolled land record on the counter and flattened it with both hands. "I want to look at the original survey for the Sweetwater section, the one filed in '71, not the copy, the original book." Pruitt blinked. "What in the world do you want with that?" "To read it," she said. There was a man at the end of the counter, a big square-shouldered rancher in a good coat, and he laughed once, short, through his nose. His name was Cyrus Vane, and he ran the largest of the 3 outfits that bordered the dry wash everyone called Sweetwater for a joke, because there had been no Sweetwater in that country since the spring on the old Mercer place dried to a seep, or so every man in Three Forks believed. Vane had 4,000 head and 11 hired riders and a standing feud with the 2 outfits north and east of him, and he had spent the better part of 2 years in that very office trying to get the Sweetwater section signed over to his name. He looked Della up and down the way you'd price a horse you had no intention of buying. "You want to read the survey," Vane said. "That's rich. Pruitt, give the widow the book. Let her read it. Maybe she'll find the water the 3 of us couldn't." Down the counter, 2 of his riders grinned at their boots. Della did not look at him. She looked at Pruitt. "The book, please. I want you to sit with how small she must have looked in that room, a woman in a dead man's vest with $11 and dust on her hands, asking a clerk for a 50-page survey book in front of the richest man in the county while his hired hands laughed into their collars. Every single person in that office had already decided how the morning would go. She would fumble through a book she couldn't make sense of. She would leave embarrassed, and by supper it would be a story they told at the stock pens. The widow, up on Bitter Mesa, thinks she's a surveyor now. That was the morning they thought they were watching. They had no idea what they were actually watching, and neither, if I am honest with you, did she. Not yet. Pruitt sighed, went to the shelf at the back, and came down with a heavy ledger-bound book gone soft at the corners. He dropped it on the counter in front of her with a thud that raised a thread of dust. 71 Survey, Sweetwater and adjacent. You've got till I close at 4. He said it like a man certain she'd be gone in 10 minutes. She opened the book. Now, here's the thing you have to understand about Della Hartwell, the thing the whole of Three Forks did not know and would not have believed if you'd told them. Before she was a widow on a burned mesa, before she was a rancher's wife at all, she had been a clerk's daughter in Independence, Missouri. Her father had copied deeds and surveys and water filings for the county recorder for 19 years. And from the time she was 9 years old, she had sat at the corner of his desk on Saturday mornings, learning to read the cramped legal hand that frightened other people off, learning what a metes and bounds description was, learning that the whole shape of a man's future could hang on a single clause buried in the middle of a paragraph that everyone else's eye slid right past. Her father used to tap the page with one ink-stained finger and say, "The money is never in the part they read out loud, Dell. It's in the part they skip." She had not thought of that in years. She thought of it now, with the 71 Survey open under her hands and the smell of dust and lamp oil in her nose and Cyrus Vane's riders laughing somewhere behind her. She did not start at the front. She turned past the cover sheet and the surveyor's oath and the plat drawing with its spidery section lines, and she went straight to the written description of the Sweetwater section itself. The long paragraph of compass bearings and chain lengths and natural monuments that legally defined the ground, and she read it the way her father had taught her to read, slowly, with her lips moving, one clause at a time, the way you read a thing you intend to remember instead of a thing you intend to be done with. It was hard going, and I want you to feel how hard, because the difficulty is the whole reason 3 rich men had skipped it. The hand was cramped and old and brown, and the language was the dense legal survey tongue that reads like a wall of stone. Thence north, 81 degrees east, 22 chains and 40 links, to a sandstone monument. Thence south, 6 degrees east, 11 chains, to a blazed cottonwood. Thence on, barren after barren, a paragraph you had to hold whole in your mind, no commas to rest on, no kindness in it anywhere. A man who ran 4,000 head and signed his name with an X for a flourish would take one look at that wall and shove the book back across the counter and say, "Just tell me, does it give me the wash or not?" And the clerk would say, "It doesn't change who holds the section," and the man would leave because he wanted the section, and the wall of bearings had told him nothing about the section. He had asked the book the wrong question, and the book, which only ever answers the exact question you ask it, had told him nothing, and he had gone away certain there was nothing in it. Della asked it a different question. She was not asking who holds the section. She was reading every single call in order because her father's voice was in her ear. Read all of it, Dell, every word, because the one you skip is always the one that mattered. And so she walked the boundary of that section on paper the way the dead surveyor had walked it on the ground, corner to corner, monument to monument, holding the whole shape of it in her head as it built. Behind her, the room got bored of her. Pruitt and Vane fell to arguing about the price of beef in Prescott, whether it would hold through the fall or break. One of the riders went out to spit and came back. The slant of light from the window crawled an inch across the floor, and Della read on, page 2, page 3, her finger moving under the line, her lips shaping the bearings, deaf to all of it, far down in the country of 1871, where a man with a chain was telling her exactly what he had seen. The room moved on without her. 4 cents a pound is robbery, Vane was saying somewhere behind her, and Pruitt was saying it would hold till the fall drives came through, and one of the riders laughed at something and the other yawned, and the little bell of attention that had jangled when the widow asked for the book stopped ringing in anyone's mind. 20 minutes passed, and then 30. They forgot she was there, which was exactly when she found it. It was on the 4th page, 4 lines from the bottom, in a sentence so long and so clotted with bearings that the eye wanted to skate across it and land on the period at the end. The surveyor, a man named Jonas Calloway, dead these 8 years, who had walked that section in the brutal August of 1871 with a chain and a compass and a notebook, had been describing the southern boundary of the section. And in the middle of that endless sentence, after a string of compass calls, he had written a reservation, a carve-out, a single clause that did one quiet thing. It lifted one small parcel out of the Sweetwater section entirely and held it separate, unpatented, reserved to the public domain pending a future claim, 40 rods square, down in the bottom of the dry wash. And the natural monument the surveyor had used to fix the corner of that reserved parcel was a phrase Della read 3 times before she let herself believe it, a living spring of good water flowing. She lifted her head. The room was just as it had been. Pruitt at the counter, Vane in his good coat, the dust hanging in the slant of light from the window. None of them were looking at her. None of them had any idea that the widow they had laughed at 6 minutes ago had just read a sentence that the 3 biggest outfits in the county had been fighting over for 2 years without ever once understanding what they were fighting over. Because the men had all read the plat. They had all looked at the picture, the section lines, the acreage. Not one of them had sat down with the written description and read the carve-out 4 lines from the bottom of the 4th page, because reading is slow and tedious, and beneath a man with 4,000 head, and besides, everyone already knew there was no live spring on Sweetwater. Everyone knew it had dried up, except a dead surveyor had stood in the bottom of that wash in 1871 and watched water come out of the ground, and he had written it down. And the law, Della's father's voice said quietly in her memory, does not care what everyone knows. The law cares what is written. She closed the book. Not slammed. Closed, gently, the way you'd close a door on a sleeping child. And she stood there a moment, with both hands flat on the worn cover, and her heart was going so hard she was certain the whole room could hear it, and she made herself breathe slow, the way you breathe when a wild thing is near and you must not spook it. "Mr. Pruitt," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I'd like to file a claim." The room turned. Vane looked over with the lazy amusement of a man humoring a child. A claim on what, Mrs. Hartwell? You can't afford the fee on the dirt you've already got. Not on the mesa, she said. She kept her eyes on Pruitt. On the reserved parcel in the bottom of the Sweetwater Wash. 40 rods square. The one the 71 survey carved out of the section and left in the public domain, subject to claim. She paused exactly one breath. I'd like to file on the spring. For a moment, nobody said anything at all. Then Cyrus Vane laughed, but it was a different laugh than before. There was a little crack in it, a hairline of uncertainty, because he had heard the words reserved parcel and public domain come out of a widow's mouth in language that sounded a great deal more like a lawyer's than a fool's. There's no spring, Vane said. That wash has been dry since before you came to this country. The survey says otherwise, Della said. And Mr. Pruitt, with respect, the survey is the law. You told 3 men there was nothing in this book for them, and you were right, because they were asking the wrong question. They wanted you to sign the whole section over. I'm not asking for the section. I'm asking to file on the 40 rods the surveyor reserved out of it. That parcel was never patented to anyone. It's open ground, and I'm standing here with the fee. Pruitt's mouth had come open. He reached past her, dragged the book back, found the page. She watched his finger track down to the 4th line from the bottom, watched his lips move, watched his face change. He read it twice. Then he looked up at her, and then he looked at Cyrus Vane, and then he did the thing a county clerk does when 20 years of caution slam up against one clean, true line on a page. He said, "Well, I'll be. Now, here is where I have to stop and tell you what that single line was actually worth, because if you do not understand the water, you will not understand the war that the next chapter of this is going to start. And it will start. 3 powerful men do not lose the only spring in 40 miles to a widow with $11 and walk away whistling. In that part of Arizona in 1884, water was not a convenience. Water was the whole game. A man could own 10,000 acres of grass, and it was worth nothing. Less than nothing. It was a liability of dust and dead cattle, if there was no live water on it in August. The 3 outfits that bordered the Sweetwater Wash, Cyrus Vane's big spread to the south, the Doer Brothers outfit to the north, and old Harlan Keene's place to the east, had been hauling water in barrels and fighting over a handful of muddy seeps for 2 summers, and they had been clawing at each other over the Sweetwater section the entire time, because every one of them believed that whoever got the section would get the rights to the wash, and whoever got the wash might, just might, find a way to bring water back to it. They had threatened each other. They had cut each other's fences. The Doer brothers had shot one of Keene's hands in the leg over a watering hole the summer before. The feud was real, and it was old, and it was getting worse, and the whole of Three Forks had been waiting to see which of the 3 big men would finally win the section and end it. And none of them had ever read the book, because the answer to 2 years of bloodshed had been sitting on a shelf in the land office the entire time, 4 lines from the bottom of the 4th page, and the only person in the county who actually opened it and read it slowly enough to find it was a widow they had laughed at for asking. Pruitt filed the claim that afternoon. He did it carefully, because he was a careful man and because he could feel the size of what was happening even if he didn't fully understand it yet. He had Della pay the entry fee, $8, which left her with 3 to her name and 2 children to feed. And he wrote out the filing in his neat clerk's hand, and he stamped it, and he entered it in the book of claims with the date, the 3rd of June, 1884, and the legal description copied word for word from the 71 survey, the reserved 40-rod parcel, fixed at its southern corner by the surveyor's note of flowing water in the wash. And he gave her a receipt. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said quietly, while Vane stood at the far end of the counter, pretending to read a stock notice and listening to every word. "I'll be honest with you. I don't know if there's water down in that wash any more or not. The survey says there was in 71, but a spring can dry. If you filed on a dry hole, you've spent $8 you didn't have on nothing." "I understand," Della said. "And if there is water," Pruitt went on, lower still, "you've just made yourself the most hated woman in 3 counties. He glanced down the counter at Vane's broad back. "Those men have been bleeding over that wash for 2 years. They are not going to be glad." "I understand that, too," she said. She rolled her own land record back up, and she tucked the receipt into the seam of her glove where the $11 had been, and she squared her shoulders under her dead husband's vest. "But I read the line, Mr. Pruitt. They had 2 years, and a clerk telling them where the book was, and not one of them read it. I read it. The water, if it's there, belongs to whoever does the work to claim it and prove it. That's the law. My father taught me that before I could ride." She paused at the door. "I aim to go find out if it's there." She walked out past Cyrus Vane. He turned as she passed, and for the first time that morning he looked at her. Really looked, not the way you look at a stray dog, but the way you look at a thing that has just cost you something and you don't yet know how much. "That's open ground, Mrs. Hartwell," he said softly, and there was no laugh in it now. "You file all the paper you want. Possession is 9 points. You ever try to put a fence around water my cattle have walked to for 2 years, we'll see how much your line on a page is worth." "It's not 9 points, Mr. Vane," Della said, just as soft. "Not against a recorded federal claim, it isn't. But you go on believing that. It'll save us both a lot of talking." And she pushed out the door into the white morning light, and the bell jangled behind her, and that was the moment, though not one soul in Three Forks would have credited it, that the widow on Bitter Mesa stopped being a story the town told for a laugh and became the woman who was about to win the only war that mattered. She did not go straight to the wash. She was no fool. She drove the wagon back up the rough track toward Bitter Mesa because her children were with her, and a dry desert wash is no place to take a 4-year-old on a hot afternoon with 3 angry ranches between you and home. The track up to the mesa was long and rough, and she had time on it. The team leaning into the grade, the children quiet in the back, and she used the time to think. Sam climbed up over the seat back part way up and settled in beside her again, and after a while he said, "Mama, those men in the office, the big one in the good coat, is he the one who's going to be mad?" "Yes," she said. "No use lying to him. He was 7, and he had a 7-year-old's nose for when grown people were lying to make a thing smaller. His name is Mr. Vane, and he's the richest man in this country, and he wanted the water, and now I've gone and put my name on it. He's going to be very mad." "Is he madder than the men at the fence were?" "Those men were just laughing, Sam. They don't matter. Mr. Vane isn't laughing. Because we got the water and he wanted it. Because we got the water and he wanted it." "How'd you know it was there and he didn't? He's grown and rich, and you're just—" The boy stopped, because he had been about to say something he knew would hurt her. "Just a widow?" she finished for him, gentle, not angry. Go on. You can say it. It's what the whole town says. I didn't mean it bad. I know you didn't. And here's the answer. He had all the cattle and all the money and all the men. I had one thing he didn't. I could read the book and he couldn't be bothered. That's the whole of it. The richest man in the county lost the only water in 40 miles because reading was beneath him, and it wasn't beneath me. She glanced down at her son. You remember that, when somebody tells you you're too small or too poor or too plain to matter. The work everybody's too proud to do is sitting right there for whoever'll stoop and do it. Can he hurt us? She was quiet a moment, choosing it true. He can try a great many things, Sam. He can be unkind, and he can lean on people not to help us. And he might send men to frighten us. But there's a thing he can't do, and you need to understand it, because it's the most important thing I'm going to teach you out here. She slapped the lines gently. He can't make the paper say a thing it doesn't say. The paper says the spring was carved out and left open, and I filed on it first and put it to use. That's written down now in a book, with a date in the clerk's own hand, and a man with all the cattle in the world can't reach into that book and change the words. The words are the words. That's what the law is when it works. It's a thing, so even a rich man has to bow to it, same as a poor woman. Your grandfather taught me that. I'm teaching it to you. The boy thought about that the whole rest of the grade. Then he said, But what if there's no water? What if the man's right, and it dried up? And there it was. The 7-year-old had walked straight to the center of it, the very fear that was sitting cold in her own chest. She looked out at the red country going gold in the late light, and she told him the truth. Then I've spent $8 we couldn't spare, and made the biggest man in this country our enemy for nothing, and we'll be worse off than we were this morning. That's the honest size of it. She let him sit with that, because he was old enough now to know the world had stakes. But I read the man's own words, Sam. He stood in that wash with a chain in his hand and saw water in the sand, and he swore an oath and wrote it down. I believe a man who walked the ground over a man who never opened the book. So tomorrow morning, before the sun, I'm going to go down to that wash and dig, and we're going to find out together which kind of man was right. She looked at him. Can you be brave and mind your sister while I do? Yes, Mama, he said, and he meant it. And that was the moment she knew, rough as the road ahead was, that she was not going to break, because she had a reason not to sitting right there beside her with his father's stubborn chin. But she did not sleep much that night. She lay under the wagon canvas with little Sam tucked against her on one side and baby June on the other, listening to Pearl the cow shift and blow in the dark, and she turned the line over in her mind the way you turn a coin in your pocket. The surveyor's own words, a dead man had stood in that wash and seen water. A dead man had written it down. The whole question of her family's life now hung on whether what was true in 1871 was still true in 1884, and there was only one way on God's earth to find out. In the gray before dawn, she rose without waking the children. She built up the little fire, set the coffee, and she looked a long time at the two sleeping shapes under the quilt. Then she did a thing that cost her more than the $8 fee had. She rode down off the mesa alone at first light, with a shovel and a tin cup, and her dead husband's old single-shot rifle across the saddle, and she left her babies sleeping under the canvas with a note pinned to the quilt for Sam, who could read a little, that said, Stay by the wagon. Mind your sister. Mama will be back by noon. She had no one to leave them with. That was the whole truth of her life. She had no one. So she did the hard arithmetic that every parent alone has done, the arithmetic of which risk is worse, and she rode down to find out if her children were going to eat that winter. The Sweetwater Wash cut through the low country a good 2 hours' ride below the mesa, a wide sand-bottomed gash between two shoulders of red rock, dotted with the gray skeletons of cottonwoods that had died when the water left. She came down into it as the sun cleared the eastern rim and threw the whole wash into gold and long blue shadow. And it was dry, bone dry. The sand was pale and loose, and the cottonwoods were dead, and the only sound was the wind and a single canyon wren saying its falling note somewhere up in the rocks. Her heart sank so far and so fast that for a moment she had to grip the saddle horn. $3. 2 children. A clerk's voice saying, "If you filed on a dry hole, you've spent $8 you didn't have on nothing." But she had not ridden 2 hours to look at the surface and quit. Her father had taught her better than that, too. She pulled the 71 survey description from her saddlebag. She had copied it out by firelight, word for word, and she read the call for the southern corner again, the bearings and the chain lengths, and she paced it off, counting her own strides against the surveyor's chains, working down the wash from the dead cottonwood that matched his witness tree. 40 rods, 30, 20, and there, where the calculation said the reserved corner should be, the sand changed. It was darker, just slightly, just a shade more brown than the pale, dry sand around it, in a low spot at the foot of the red rock shoulder where a man on horseback passing through would never look twice. She got down on her knees in the sand, and she dug. She dug with the shovel, throwing the pale, dry sand up over her shoulder, and the hole filled in half as fast as she emptied it, the loose sand sliding back down the sides, so that for every 2 shovelfuls she lifted, she lost 1. The sun climbed. Sweat ran into her eyes, and she wiped it with a forearm that only smeared grit across her face. A foot down the sand was the same dry, pale stuff, and the cold doubt sat in her chest and said, "You fool, you read a 13-year-old book and rode down here on a dead man's word, and now you're digging a grave for $8 in a dry wash while your babies sleep alone on a mesa." She kept digging. 2 feet down, she had to widen the hole just to keep it from caving, and her shoulders were on fire, and she sat back on her heels once and pressed her dirty hands to her face and made herself breathe, because the panic was rising, and the panic would not dig. "You'd better have seen it, Mr. Calloway," she said out loud, to the dead surveyor, to the empty wash, to the bone-white sky, because there was no one else in 40 miles to say it to, and the saying of it steadied her hands. "You swore an oath. You stood right here with your chain, and you wrote it down. A living spring of good water flowing, and I believed you over 3 rich men who never opened your book. So you'd best have been an honest man." She wiped the grit off her mouth with the back of her wrist. "Because I've got $3 and 2 children and your 1 line, and that's the whole of what I own in this world." She looked down into the hole at the pale, dry sand, and her voice dropped. "My father always said the money's in the part they skip. Well, you're the part they skipped, Mr. Calloway. Don't you make a liar of him." And she took up the shovel and bent back to it, talking herself down into the ground 1 cut at a time. "A little deeper, just a little deeper. The flood would have laid it over. You have to go under the flood. the way a person prays who has run clean out of any other help. Then she put her hand flat on the bottom of the hole to brace for the next cut, and she stopped. The sand at the bottom was cool, not cellar cool, not shade cool. Cool the way the lip of a well is cool, damp. She pressed her fingers in, and they came up dark, and she smelled them, and there it was. Mineral, mossy, the smell of water and earth, faint but unmistakable. The smell you do not get from dry ground, no matter how deep you dig. Her heart kicked once, hard. She abandoned the shovel and went at it with the tin cup. Faster now, scooping the damp, dark sand out by the cupful. And then the cup was too slow, and she went at it with her bare hands, both of them, gouging and flinging, and the sand got darker and wetter with every handful until it was mud, cold black mud sucking at her fingers, and then her hands went down into the next scoop and came up not with mud, but with water, actual water, standing in her cupped palms, running between her fingers, cold as a January creek. And she stared at it, and below her in the hole, the water was already welling up, rising faster than the thirsty sand could pull it down, filling the bottom of the hole and standing and brimming and overflowing and running in a thin, bright thread down the slope of the hole and into the wash. The spring had not dried. The spring had only been buried, silted over in some flood year, hidden under 3 feet of sand, invisible from above, alive and flowing the whole time under a wash that the 3 big men of the valley had ridden across 100 times and sworn was dead. The dead surveyor had not lied. He had simply seen it before the flood that hid it and written it down and left it there in the book for the one person in 13 years willing to read the line and come dig. Della Hartwell knelt in the sand with cold water running over her wrists, and she laughed and she cried at the same time in the gold of that early light, alone in the bottom of the wash. And she cupped her hands and drank, and it was sweet, actually sweet, faintly mineral, cold enough to ache her teeth. And she filled the tin cup and held it up to the morning, hardly able to believe she was allowed to hold it. Then she got hold of herself, because she was a clerk's daughter and a widow and a mother, and she knew the law down to its bones, and she knew that finding the water was not the same as keeping it. She did 3 things that morning, in order the careful way she did everything that mattered. First, she dug the hole out wider and lined the lip of it with flat stones so the water would pool clean and not silt back over. And she made a little channel for the overflow, so that any man who came down into that wash would see with his own eyes that the spring was live and flowing and being put to beneficial use. Because, under the law, water has to be used, not just claimed, and she meant to leave no doubt that it was used. Second, she walked the bounds of her 40 rods, and she set a stake at each corner, peeled cedar with the date and her name and the words, Federal Claim, June 3rd, 1884, cut into them with her knife, because a claim you cannot see is a claim a strong man will pretend he never saw. And third, and this was the clerk's daughter being smarter than the 3 ranchers put together, she rode straight back to town, not to her wagon, and she went into the land office. And she had Mr. Alvin Pruitt come out with her the next morning as a sworn witness and look upon the flowing spring with his own eyes and enter in the official book that on the 4th of June, 1884, the claimant Della Hartwell had reduced the reserved parcel to beneficial use, water flowing, spring developed, claim staked. She made the law itself come down and watch the water run. After that, No man alive could stand in that office and say there had never been a spring. Getting Pruitt down to the wash was its own small battle and worth the telling, because it shows you the kind of patience she fought with. She rode back into town that same afternoon, dirt to the elbows and triumph in her chest, and she walked into the land office and said, "Mr. Pruitt, the spring is flowing. I've dug it out, and it's running. I need you to come and see it and enter what you see in the book." Pruitt looked at her over his spectacles like she'd asked him to walk to the moon. "Mrs. Hartwell, I have an office to keep. I can't be riding all over the county to look at every hole a person digs." "It's not a hole. It's a developed spring on a recorded federal claim. And you're the recording officer," she said, even and patient. "If a federal man comes down from Prescott 6 weeks from now, the first thing he'll want is a sworn local witness who saw the water flowing on a stated date. You're that witness, Mr. Pruitt, whether you ride out or not, because there isn't another officer in 40 miles. I'd rather you saw it with your own eyes and wrote down the truth than have to swear later to a thing you only heard about." She let that settle. An hour and a half down, an hour and a half back. "I'll have coffee on. And you'll be the man who can say, in any court, I stood at the spring and watched it run. That's worth an afternoon." He grumbled. He found 3 more reasons. But she had him, and they both knew it, because everything she'd said was true, and Alvin Pruitt, for all his know before the question, was at bottom an honest clerk who did not want to swear to a thing second-hand. He closed the office an hour early and rode out with her, complaining the whole way about his knees and the heat, and they came down into the wash in the long gold light of evening, and he stopped complaining, because there it was, a wash everyone in the county had sworn for years was dead, and in the middle of it a clear pool ringed with flat stones, water welling up visibly from the bottom, a bright overflow thread running off down the sand, and a green smell in the air that did not belong to dry country. Pruitt sat his horse and stared. He got down. He walked over and crouched and put his hand in the water, and he cupped some and drank, and his eyebrows went up. "Sweet," he said, almost to himself, the same word she had said that morning. He looked up the wash and down it, at the dead cottonwoods and the pale sand, and then back at the impossible live water at his feet, and he said the thing she would hear a dozen people say over the coming weeks, the thing that was the whole story in 4 words. It was here all along. "Under 3 feet of flood sand," she said. "Buried, not dry. The surveyor saw it before the flood hit it. He wrote it true." She had the book of claims open on a flat rock and the ink pot beside it. "Now write down what you see, Mr. Pruitt, in your own hand, with today's date, just the truth. Spring flowing, developed to beneficial use, claim staked, witnessed by you. That's all I want." And he did. He wrote it carefully. The 4th of June, 1884, the claimant present, the spring flowing and developed, witnessed, and so entered by Alvin Pruitt, county clerk, and he signed it, and when he straightened up and looked at her, something had changed in how he looked at her, and he said, "Ms. Hartwell, you understand what you got here." It wasn't a question. Every outfit in this valley has bled for 2 years over the dream of water in this wash, and you've got it. Real, recorded flowing in your name. He glanced around the empty wash, almost nervous, as though Vane might be behind a rock. "They are going to come for this." "Then I'm glad," she said, capping the ink pot, "that the truth is written down in your book before they do." "But I am getting ahead of the war. And there was a war. And it is time to bring the three men into it, because the very afternoon Pruitt entered that line, Cyrus Vane heard about it at the stock pens, and Cyrus Vane was not a man who lost things quietly. She moved the family down off Bitter Mesa to the Wash the next day, because there was no sense being 2 hours from the thing she had to protect, and because for the first time in 5 months, she had something better to offer her children than a burned roof and a dry mesa. She built a brush shelter on the bank above the spring, a lean-to of cut cedar and canvas, and she made it as much a home as a brush shelter can be. The quilt laid out, a fire ring of stones, Pearl picketed on the new grass that was already greening at the spring's overflow, the 4 hens in a willow coop. And that first evening, with the supper eaten and the desert going violet and the spring talking quietly to itself in the dark below, she sat with June asleep in her lap and Sam leaning on her shoulder, and the boy said, watching the firelight, "Mama, is this ours now? Really ours?" And she said, "The water is, Sam, 40 rods of it, recorded in the book with our name." And he was quiet, and then he said, "It's the first thing that's been ours since Pa." And she had to look hard at the fire for a minute, and then she said, "Yes, and we're going to keep it, whatever comes." She did not know yet everything that was coming, but she meant it, and the meaning of it was iron. I'll pause us right there for one breath, because I know a lot of you are riding along while you do the supper dishes, or fold the wash, or sit up with something that won't let you sleep, and I'm glad of your company on this dark road. If the widow's got hold of you the way she got hold of that valley, do tap the like. It's the one small thing that hands this story to the next stranger who needs it tonight. And keep your comment coming about where you're listening from. I mean it that I read them. Now, back down into the Wash, because the peace of that first night did not last, and the men were already coming. It began, as these things do, with the fence, because the Wash had been open range for as long as any man could remember, and because, dry as it was, the cattle still drifted through it. All 3 outfits had been letting their stock cross the Sweetwater bottom for years. And now the widow had dug a spring smack in the middle of the crossing and fenced 40 rods around it, and on the 3rd day after she developed it, Cyrus Vane sent 2 of his riders down with wire cutters and a wagon, and they cut her stakes off at the ground and pulled up 40 rods of the cedar post line she had spent 2 days setting. And they drove 100 head of Vane cattle straight into water at her spring as if she had never been there at all. Della was at the spring when they came. She had brought Sam and June down with her. She would not leave them on the mesa again, not with men this angry in the country. And she had built a little brush shelter by the water, and the children were playing in the shade of it while she worked at deepening the pool. She heard the cattle first, the low rolling rumble of 100 head moving in a hurry, and then she saw the dust, and then she saw the 2 riders, and she knew exactly what was happening, and her whole body went cold. But she did not run. She took Sam by the shoulder, and she said, quiet and clear, "Take your sister up into the rocks, to the flat place, and stay there till I call you. Go now. Don't argue." And the boy, 7 years old and white-faced, took his sister's hand and went, because there was something in his mother's voice he had never heard before, and it frightened him more than the cattle did. Then Della Hartwell walked out into the middle of her claim with her dead husband's single-shot rifle held across her body, not pointed, not raised, just held, the way a person holds a thing so that everyone understands she has it. And she stood between the spring and the oncoming cattle, and she waited. The two riders pulled up in a boil of dust. The lead one was a lean, weathered man named Pete Sorrel, Vane's range boss, and he looked down at her from his horse with the flat contempt of a man who had cut 100 fences and never once been stopped. "Move out of the way, missus," Sorrel said. "These cattle need water, and Mr. Vane's done waiting on your paper games." "This is a recorded federal claim," Della said. Her voice did not shake, which surprised her. "Those stakes you cut said so. You're standing on it. Pull your cattle back to the section line." Sorrel laughed. "Or what? You'll shoot 100 head with a single shot? Lady, there's no law within 40 miles but Mr. Vane. You filed a piece of paper. We pulled it up. That's how it works out here." He nudged his horse a step forward. "Now move, before somebody's kids get trampled." That was the wrong thing to say to her. The mention of the children, something in Della went very still and very calm, the calm on the far side of fear, and she did not raise the rifle, but she did not move either, and she said, in a voice that carried across the whole wash, "You tell Cyrus Vane I read the line he never bothered to read. You tell him the spring is mine on paper, filed in the county book, and witnessed by the clerk, and developed to beneficial use under his own nose. And you tell him this." She took one step forward, toward the horse, and the gelding tossed its head. "Every steer of his that drinks here from this day is drinking off a recorded claim without leave, and I have a witness in town who logged the date, and the next man I find cutting my line, I will not stop at your boss. I will write to the United States Land Office at Prescott and to the Surveyor General of the Territory, and I will send them a certified copy of the 71 survey with the reservation marked, and they will send a federal man down here who does not care one whit how many cattle Cyrus Vane runs. Now, you take your 100 head back to the section line, Mr. Sorrel, and you tell your boss the widow he laughed at knows the law better than he does." It was the words Surveyor General and United States Land Office that did it. Sorrel was a range boss, not a fool, and he had spent his life around the rough edges of property law, and he heard in those words something he had not expected to hear from a woman in a dead man's vest. He heard a person who knew the names of the offices, who knew the machinery, who knew that out past the local power of a man with 4,000 head, there was a larger, colder, slower power that did not care about cattle at all, only about what was written. He sat his horse a moment, chewing it over. Then he turned and looked at the spring, at the flowing water and the wider, deeper pool she dug, undeniably live, undeniably worked, and he did the arithmetic that hard men do, and he decided this was not the day and not the way. "This ain't over," Sorrel said. "Vane wants this water. You know that." "I know it," Della said. "Take your cattle back." And he did. He cursed, and he wheeled his horse, and he and the other rider drove the 100 head back out of the wash and up toward the section line, and the dust hung gold in the afternoon light and slowly settled, and Della Hartwell stood alone in the middle of her claim with her husband's rifle in her hands and her heart finally beginning to shake now that it was over. And up in the rocks a small voice called down, "Mama, can we come down now?" And she said yes. And she sat down hard in the sand by the spring, and she held both her children, and she did not let them see her cry. That night, by the little fire in the brush shelter, with the children asleep and the desert stars hard and close overhead, Della Hartwell did the thing she had threatened to do, because she was not a woman who threatened things she would not do. She got out paper and the stub of a pencil, and she wrote by firelight a careful letter to the Register of the United States Land Office in Prescott. She wrote it the way her father had taught her to write things to officials, plain, exact, dated, citing the survey of 1871 by its filing number, describing the reserved parcel by its legal metes and bounds, stating the date of her entry and the date of her development to beneficial use, and respectfully requesting that the office confirm the standing of her claim against any conflicting use. She did not whine, she did not plead, she laid out the facts the way you lay out cards you know are good, and she signed it, and in the morning she wrote it to town and posted it, and she paid for it to go certified, which cost her the last of her $3, so that now she had a federal claim on the only water in 40 miles and not 1 cent to her name. And she did not care, because she had learned the most important thing her father ever taught her, which was that against money and cattle and 40 hired riders, a poor person has exactly one weapon, and that weapon is the written law, used exactly right. And she meant to use it exactly right, or die in that wash trying. She carried the letter into the post the next morning herself, and that was its own small test, because the postmaster was a careful man named Hobbs, who answered to the same town pressure as everyone else. He took the envelope and read the address, and his eyebrows went up. Register of the United States Land Office, he read aloud, slow. Prescott. He looked at her over the counter. You sure you want your name on a thing going to the federal government, Mrs. Hartwell? Folks hereabouts are saying, I know what folks are saying, Mr. Hobbs, Della said. Folks have been saying I won't hold a week since the morning I came down off that mesa. I'm still here. She set the last of her coin on the counter, all of it. I'd like it sent certified, please, with a receipt that shows the date it left your hand and mine. Hobbs looked at the coins, and he looked at the woman, and something passed over his face that was not unkindness. He pushed one of the coins back across the wood with one finger. Certified's the same price as plain to me, he said quietly, which was not true, and they both knew it was not true. He stamped the envelope and wrote out the receipt in a careful hand and dated it and signed it, and he slid it across to her. There, left my hand the 6th of June, witnessed. You hold on to that. He paused. My wife's people homesteaded a dry quarter out by the Keene line. I know what a summer with no water does to a family. Whatever they're saying on the porch, there's some of us hope your line holds, missus. That's all I'll say about it. It was the smallest thing. A pushed-back coin, a quiet word from a careful man who would never say it loud. But Della Hartwell walked out of that post office holding a dated federal receipt and the first plain, decent words anyone in Three Forks had given her in 2 weeks, and she understood that the wall Vane had built around her had just shown its first hairline crack in the unlikeliest place, and that cracks, once they start, run. The letter went out on the 6th of June. It would be weeks before any answer came back from Prescott, and weeks more before a federal man could ride down, and Cyrus Vane knew it, and the Doer brothers knew it, and Harlan Keene knew it, and so the second front of the war opened, not at the spring, but in the town, where they set about doing the thing powerful men do when the law is slow and they are impatient. They set about turning the town against her, so that even if her paper held, she would have no place to buy flour, no place to shoe a horse, no soul to stand with her, and she would break and leave before the Federal man ever came. It worked at first. That is the part I will not hide from you, because the story is no good to you if I make it easy. For 2 weeks it worked. She went into the mercantile on the 8th of June with a basket of eggs to trade. Pearl gave milk, and she had 4 laying hens, and eggs and butter were the only money she had. And the storekeeper, a heavy-set man named Dorsey, who had always taken her eggs before, looked at the basket and then looked past her at nothing and said, "I'm full up on eggs, Mrs. Hartwell," which was a lie, and they both knew it was a lie, and behind her at the counter 2 ranch wives went quiet and looked at the floor. She understood at once. Vane had been in, or one of the dowers. A word had gone round. Don't trade with the widow. She's stolen the water out from under 3 good families and put her own greed ahead of the whole valley, and any man who helps her can answer to Vane. She stood there a moment with her basket of eggs and her face hot, and then she said, "All right, Mr. Dorsey," quiet and dignified, and she walked out, and she did not give a single one of them the satisfaction of seeing her break. It got worse before it got better. A boy threw a clod of dirt at her wagon, and his father on the porch laughed instead of cuffing him. Someone, she never learned who, left a dead rattlesnake coiled on a stick stuck in the ground at the head of the wash track. A plain, ugly message that she pulled up and threw in the brush before the children could see it. At the blacksmith's, when Pearl threw a problem with her hoof and Della asked the smith to look at the cow's foot, the man wiped his hands and said he was backed up 3 weeks, which was a lie, and she led the limping cow away with her face burning. The hardest was a Sunday. She had taken the children to the little plank church at the edge of town, the way she always had, because her mother had raised her to it and because the children needed something steady. And she came in quiet and sat in the back pew with Sam and June scrubbed and combed. And she felt it the moment she came through the door. The heads that turned, the whispers behind hymn books, the woman in the second row who gathered her skirts aside as though the widow carried something catching. After the service on the steps in the sun, 2 of the ranch wives stood square in her path, and one of them, a sharp-faced woman married to one of Vane's lieutenants, said, loud enough for the whole congregation filing out behind, "I'm surprised you can sit in a house of God, Della Hartwell, with what you've done. The whole valley suffering, and you with your fist closed around the only water. I hope you can pray with that on your conscience." And Della stood there on the church steps with her 2 clean children pressed against her, in front of the whole town, and the old shame rose up hot in her throat, and for 1 second she nearly gave them what they wanted, nearly broke, nearly fired back something bitter. But she felt June's small hand in hers, and she heard her mother's voice from a long way off, and she took 1 breath, and she did not break. "I'll pray," she said quiet and level, looking the woman full in the face. "I'll pray for rain and for honest neighbors, and I'll pray for the families whose cattle are dying. And Mrs. Pryor, you can tell your husband and Mr. Vane that I have never once turned a thirsty animal from my water, and I never will. If your cattle are dying, that's not my closed fist. That's their refusal to come and ask me like neighbors instead of cutting my fence in the dark. Good morning to you." And she walked down the steps with her head up and her children's hands in hers, and behind her the congregation was very quiet, because The widow had not behaved the way a thief behaves when she is caught. She had answered the way a woman answers when the truth is on her side, plain and unafraid, and some of them standing on those steps in the Sunday sun began for the very first time to wonder if it was. That same hard week she met the Tuckers, and the Tuckers mattered, so hold on to them. They were a young homestead family on a poor quarter section out past the wash. Eli Tucker, a lean, worried man not yet 30, his wife Ada, and a passel of children, the oldest a girl of 9 named Sari. They had no big outfit, no hired riders, no power at all. They had a milk cow gone dry from the drought and a vegetable patch dying and a baby. And Eli Tucker, who had heard the same poison about the greedy widow that everyone had heard, came to the head of the wash track one evening with his hat in his hands and his pride in the dust, because his baby needed milk and his cow needed water, and he had run out of other doors to knock on. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said, not able to look at her, "they say you won't share the water, but my little one's poorly and our cow's near dry, and I had to come ask. I can't pay. I've got nothing to pay with. But I'd work it off, any way you named, if you'd let my cow drink and let me haul a barrel for the baby." And Della Hartwell looked at that proud, broken young father, and she saw her own self of 5 months ago. And she said, "Mr. Tucker, bring your cow down tomorrow and bring 2 barrels, and don't you say another word about paying. Any honest family in this valley drinks from this spring, and I'll hear no more about it." "They told me you'd turned the whole valley away," Eli Tucker said, his voice gone thick, "that you'd locked it up for spite." "I know what they told you. They tell it about me because the truth makes them small. You bring your barrels, Mr. Tucker. Bring them every day this drought lasts. And tell any honest soul too scared to ask that the widow's water is open to them too." And Eli Tucker's face did a thing, and he turned away so she wouldn't see it, and the next day he brought his cow and his barrels, and Ada Tucker brought a basket of the last good vegetables from their dying patch as a gift. Della tried to refuse and couldn't, and from that day the Tuckers would have walked into fire for the widow on the Sweetwater. Remember them. They come back. The wife of one of the Doer brothers stopped her in the street and said, loud enough for the porch to hear, "You ought to be ashamed. My husband's cattle are dying in this drought, and you fenced off the one spring in the country for your own self. What kind of Christian woman does that?" And Della. And this is the moment I want you to hold, because this is the moment her dignity turned the corner, did not argue the law. She knew the law was on her side, but she also knew that you do not win a town with the law. You win a town the other way. "Mrs. Doer," Della said gently, in front of the whole porch, "your husband's cattle don't have to die. The spring runs more than my one cow can drink. I've never once turned a thirsty animal away from that water, and I never will. Any family in this valley that's hurting for water in this drought is welcome to come haul a barrel or water their stock in an orderly way. With my leave, the water belongs to me on the paper, but I have never said it belongs only to me in the using. It was your husband's and Mr. Vane who wanted it locked up for one outfit alone, not me. I only wanted to be sure no one outfit could take it and shut the rest of you out. Send your husband down to talk to me like a neighbor instead of cutting my fence in the dark, and we'll see if there isn't water enough for the honest families in this valley to share." There was a silence on that porch you could have heard a pin drop into, because not a single soul in Three Forks had heard the situation put that way. Vane had told them the widow had stolen the water and locked it up for herself. And here was the widow, standing in the middle of the street with her chin level, offering to share the very water they'd been told she'd stolen, offering it to the families, not to the big outfits that had been bleeding each other for 2 years. And Mrs. Dorr, who was a decent woman, married into a hard family, stood there with her mouth open, and then she said slowly, "You'd let us haul water?" "Any honest family that asks," Della said. "I have 2 children too, Mrs. Dorr. I know what it is to watch them go thirsty. I would never do to your family what's being done to mine." It did not turn the whole town that day, but it turned Mrs. Dorr, and Mrs. Dorr went home and said something to her husband over supper that started a crack running through the wall Vane had built. Because it is one thing to hate a greedy woman who stole the water. It is another thing entirely to hate a poor widow who offered to share it with your own thirsty children while the rich man told you lies about her. The Dorr brothers ran the second biggest outfit in the valley, and they had been Vane's allies in the section fight only because they were both Vane's rivals. And it began to dawn on the elder Dorr, a thoughtful man named Albert Dorr, that perhaps the Widow Spring was not his enemy at all. Perhaps the Widow Spring, shared honestly among the families and held safe from any one big outfit's greed, was the best thing that had happened to the valley in 2 years. Perhaps the enemy had always been Cyrus Vane's hunger to have it all. But Vane was not done, and Vane was the dangerous one. And on the night of the 14th of June, with the moon down and the desert black, somebody crept down into the Sweetwater Wash and tried to destroy the spring itself. Della woke to Pearl, the cow lowing in alarm and the hen setting up a racket. And she came out of the brush shelter with the rifle, and she saw in the faint starlight 2 shapes at the spring. And she smelled, before she fully understood it, the sharp mineral stink of something being poured. They were dumping sacks of something into her pool. Salt, she thought first, in a flash of horror. A man can ruin a spring with enough salt, foul the water for a season. She raised the rifle, and she fired the single shot over their heads into the dark, the crack of it enormous in the silent wash, and she screamed, "Get away from that water!" in a voice that brought both children awake and crying, and the 2 shapes bolted, scrambling up the far slope and onto horses she now heard stamping in the rocks, and they were gone into the dark, and she was left standing over her fouled spring with an empty rifle and her heart hammering and her children screaming behind her. She did not sleep again that night. At first light she went down to the pool with dread in her chest, and she found it half full of dumped sand and gravel, and yes, 2 emptied salt sacks lying in the mud. But here the dead surveyor's spring saved itself, because a live flowing spring is not a still pond. It runs. It clears. By the time the sun was full up, the spring had already begun to flush itself, the cold water welling up from below, pushing the fouled water and loose sand out down the overflow channel. And Della spent the whole of that day on her knees, clearing the gravel out by the cupful and relining the pool, and by evening the water ran clear and cold and sweet again, and the spring had beaten the men who tried to kill it, but she had the 2 salt sacks, and on each one, stenciled on the burlap, was the brand of the supplier in Prescott who sold to the big outfits, and Della Hartwell, clerk's daughter, did not throw those sacks away. She folded them and she kept them, because evidence is evidence, and she had a feeling she was going to need it. But the salting frightened the children badly, more than the cattle had, because it had come in the dark while they slept. And that night little June would not stop crying, and Sam sat by the fire with the empty rifle across his knees like a small, grim soldier, and would not go to sleep. And Della sat down between them and pulled them both in close, and she did not pretend it had been nothing. "I'm scared, Mama," June said into her shoulder, the way a 4-year-old says it, with her whole body. "I know, baby," Della said. "I am too, a little. But I want you to listen to me, both of you." She tipped Sam's chin up so he'd look at her. "Those men came in the dark because the dark is where cowards work. They couldn't beat us in the daylight, not in the office, not at the spring, not in front of the clerk. So they sneaked in at night to wreck what they couldn't take. That's not strength, Sam. That's the opposite. And do you know what happened? The spring beat them anyway, all by itself, because it's alive and it runs and it washed their salt right out by morning. They poured in the worst they had, and by sunup the water was sweet again." She kissed June's hair. "We are going to be all right, because we're in the right, and the right is a deep well, and theirs is a shallow one, and a shallow well runs dry first. Now, tomorrow your mama's going to do a brave thing, and I need you brave too." And she told them simply what she meant to do, and the telling of it steadied her own nerve as much as theirs, and by, June slept, and Sam slept, and Della sat awake by the fire and folded the 2 salt sacks, careful and small, because she had decided. She rode to town that morning, the 15th of June, not to trade, but to do something that took a kind of courage most people never have to find. She rode straight to the small house at the edge of town where the circuit was due, because word had come that the territorial circuit judge, a man named Judge Harmon Pettibone, was passing through Three Forks that very week on his rounds, holding court 2 days in the back room of the hotel for whatever cases the county had stacked up. And Della Hartwell, who had no lawyer and no money and no one to speak for her, walked into that makeshift courtroom on the first morning of the session, in her clean dress and her dead husband's vest, with a roll of papers under her arm and 2 salt sacks in a flour bag, and she asked the judge for a hearing. The room was full. Word had gotten round that there might be sport. The widow against Vane, the water case, everyone in Three Forks wanted to see it. Cyrus Vane was there in his good coat, with a real lawyer beside him, a smooth Prescott attorney named Mr. Sewall, whom Vane had paid to come down and crush the thing. The Doer brothers were there. Old Harlan Keene was there. Pruitt the clerk was there, looking nervous. And Judge Pettibone, a gray-bearded man with the tired, patient eyes of someone who had spent 30 years sorting out what people would do to each other over land and water, looked over his spectacles at the widow standing alone before his bench and said, not unkindly, "And what's your matter, missus?" "Your Honor," Della said, "my name is Della Hartwell. I've filed a recorded federal claim on a spring in the Sweetwater Wash, witnessed by the county clerk and developed to beneficial use. 3 times now, men in the employ of the large outfits in this valley have cut my fence, driven cattle onto my claim against my leave, and 4 nights ago 2 men came in the dark and fouled my spring with salt and sand in an attempt to destroy it. I have no lawyer, Your Honor. I cannot afford one. But I have the survey, I have the filing, I have the clerk who witnessed it, and I have the salt sacks the men left behind, and I am asking this court for an order protecting my claim until the federal land office at Prescott can confirm my title. I am one widow with 2 small children against 3 of the most powerful men in this county, and the only thing I have on my side is the law, and I am asking the law to do what it is for. You could have heard the dust settle. And before the judge could even answer, Vane's lawyer, Mr. Sewall, was on his feet, smooth as oiled glass, and he began to do exactly what a paid lawyer does. He said the claim was defective. He said a woman could not hold a water claim in her own name in the territory. He said the so-called reservation in the survey was a clerical error, a meaningless scribble that no reasonable surveyor would have intended to carve a public parcel out of the middle of a patented section. He said there was no spring, that the whole thing was a fraud, that the widow had dug a hole and called it a spring to extort the honest ranchers of the valley. He was good. He was very good. And the room began to murmur and to nod, because he was a man in a fine coat, saying confident things, and the widow was a poor woman standing alone. But Della Hartwell had been raised at a recorder's desk, and she had been waiting for exactly this. And when the lawyer sat down satisfied, she did not look at him. She looked at the judge, and she said, "Your Honor, may I answer the gentleman's 3 points?" "You may," said Judge Pettibone, and he leaned back, and something in his tired eyes had sharpened, because in 30 years on the circuit, he had learned to tell the difference between a person who was about to flounder and a person who was about to land a fish. "He says a woman cannot hold a water claim in her own name in this territory," Della said. "He is mistaken. The territorial statute of 1865, which I have copied here and respectfully hand up, makes no distinction of sex in the appropriation of water for beneficial use. The right belongs to whoever first puts the water to use, man or woman. The gentleman knows this. He is hoping the court does not." She handed up the paper. The judge read it. He nodded slowly. Sewall was on his feet before the judge finished reading. "Your Honor, an 1865 statute, if it even says what she claims, is 20 years stale. Water law in this territory has moved on." "Has it been repealed, Mr. Sewall?" Della asked, before the judge could speak, and she said it to the lawyer now, the first time she had turned to him at all. "That is not—" "It is exactly the question," she said. "A statute is the law until it is repealed or struck. Has the legislature of this territory repealed the law of 1865 on the appropriation of water?" "I am not here to be examined by the claimant," Sewall said stiffly. "Then I'll ask the court," Della said, turning back to the bench. "Your Honor, is that statute still on the books?" "It is," said Judge Pettibone, who had been a territorial lawyer before he was a judge and knew his water code cold. "Amended once, in 73, on the matter of ditch companies, not on the point of who may appropriate. The gentleman's right that it's old. Old isn't the same as dead, Mr. Sewall, as you well know. Sit down. Let her finish." Sewall sat down. He did not like it. "He says the reservation in the survey is a meaningless clerical error," Della went on. "But the surveyor, Mr. Jonas Calloway, took an oath in 71 to describe the ground truly, and he wrote in his own careful hand a reservation of 40 rods square at the southern boundary, fixed by, and I quote the survey he swore to, a living spring of good water flowing. A man does not carve a reservation by accident and then anchor its corner to a named natural monument by accident. The reservation is deliberate. It is recorded. It is sworn, and it is the law of that ground until a court of competent jurisdiction strikes it, which no court ever has. The gentleman calls it a scribble. The United States calls it a survey. And she handed up the certified copy of the relevant page, the reservation underlined. The room was dead silent now. Vane's lawyer had stopped looking smooth. But Sewall was a paid man and a good one, and he was not done. He came up off his chair, and he said sharp, "Your Honor, this is all very clever, but a copy is not proof. The defense has not seen the original survey book. For all this court knows, the claimant, being by her own account a clerk's daughter, handy with a pen, wrote that reservation in herself." It was a low thing to say, and a clever one, and a murmur ran the room, because it planted a doubt. And Judge Pettibone looked at Della and said, "It's a fair question, Missus. Can you answer it?" "I can, Your Honor," Della said, "and I'm glad he asked it, because it's the easiest of all to answer. The original survey book is not in my keeping, and never has been. It sits on the shelf of the county land office, in the custody of Mr. Alvin Pruitt, the recording officer, exactly where it has sat for 13 years, and any man in this room may walk down the street and fetch it." She turned to the judge. "I'd ask the court to send for it. Send your own man. Let Mr. Pruitt bring the original book under his oath of office, and open it to the 4th page, and read the 4th line from the bottom aloud in his own voice, so no one need take my copy or my word for anything. The truth is, in his book, I'm only the one who read it. There is a particular silence that falls when a bluff is called, and it fell on Mr. Sewall then, because he had gambled that the original was somewhere it could be questioned, and instead the widow had just invited the court to send for the very book and have a sworn officer read it out, which is the last thing on earth a man wants when he's been calling the document a forgery. The judge sent his bailiff down the street. The whole room waited 10 long minutes, in a quiet you could lean on, and the bailiff came back with a heavy old book, and the judge had Pruitt sworn right there, hand on the Bible, and Pruitt took the book and found the page, everyone watching his finger go down the lines. And the judge said, "Read it, Mr. Pruitt, the reservation, slow so the room hears it." And Alvin Pruitt, county clerk, in a voice that shook a little at first and then steadied, read aloud from the dead surveyor's own 13-year-old hand the long, clotted sentence of Bearings, and then the carve-out, and then the words that ended it, a living spring of good water flowing. And when he reached those words, he stopped, and the silence after them was the loudest thing in the room, because there it was, not a copy, the original, sworn in 71, recorded, untouched, read out by the officer who'd kept it exactly as the widow had said. Sewall sat down and did not get up again. So the reservation was real, proven from the original. But Sewall had made a second claim, that there was no spring at all, that the wash was dry, and the widow had dug a hole and lied. And Della turned to that now, because a reservation is worth nothing if the water is gone. "The gentleman also says there is no spring," she said, "that I dug a dry hole and called it water to extort honest men. Your Honor, I have 2 witnesses against that. The first you have already sworn, Mr. Pruitt, who not only keeps the book, but came down to the wash himself on the 4th of June and saw the water flowing with his own eyes, and entered that too in the official record. Ask him whether the spring runs." And the judge looked at Pruitt, still standing, still sworn, And Pruitt said low and honest, "It runs, your honor. I drank from it. It's the sweetest water in the county." A murmur went the room. "And the second witness," Della said, and now her voice dropped and went hard and cold as the spring itself, "is sitting at that table. Because if there is no spring, your honor, if the wash is dry and worthless and I am a liar, then I would respectfully ask the gentleman's client to explain to this court why, on the night of the 14th of June, 2 men in his employ rode into a dry, worthless wash in the dark and emptied 2 sacks of salt into a hole that he now tells you holds no water." And she reached into the flour bag, and she drew out the 2 salt sacks, stenciled with the Prescott Suppliers brand, and she laid them on the rail in front of the judge. "Men do not poison water that isn't there, your honor. You salt a spring because you are afraid of it. The defense cannot have it both ways. Either there is no spring, in which case his client is a vandal and a liar who salts dry holes for sport, or there is a spring, and it is mine, recorded and witnessed and worth so much that 3 powerful men have cut my fence and poisoned my water rather than read the line that says it was never theirs to begin with. I wish you could have been in that room. I wish you could have seen Cyrus Vane's face go from red to gray as a poor widow with no lawyer took his paid Prescott attorney apart point by point with nothing but the written law and 2 burlap sacks. And the murmur that ran through the crowd was not against her now, but with her, turning all at once. "She salted her own dry hole, did she?" somebody said low and hard at the back, and somebody else said, "No, he salted it. You heard her. He salted hers." Because every soul in that room understood in that moment exactly what had happened. The widow they had laughed at had been right about everything. There was a spring. It was hers, and the big men had known it was real all along. They had known it well enough to try to destroy it in the dark, while they stood in public and told the valley it was a fraud. Judge Pettibone took off his spectacles. He looked at the salt sacks a long moment. He looked at the certified survey page. He looked at Pruitt, who nodded again, miserable and honest. And then he looked at Cyrus Vane, and his tired old eyes were not tired any more. "Mr. Sewall," the judge said quietly, "does your client wish to tell this court where those salt sacks came from?" Sewall opened his mouth. He closed it. He leaned and whispered to Vane, and Vane's jaw worked. And he said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would not make it worse. "I didn't think so," said the judge. He put his spectacles back on, and he picked up his pen, and he spoke in the flat, carrying voice of a man entering a thing in the record. "On the matter of Hartwell's claim, the court finds the survey of 1871 to be valid, sworn, and recorded, and the reservation therein to be deliberate and binding. The court finds the territorial statute of 1865 to permit the claimant, a woman, to appropriate water for beneficial use in her own name. The court finds, on the witness of the county clerk and on the remarkable evidence of the defense's own salt, that there is in fact a living spring on the reserved parcel, and that the claimant has developed it to beneficial use and holds the senior right to it." He set down the pen and leaned forward, and the court issues an order, effective at once, restraining Cyrus Vane, the Dorr outfit, Harlan Keene, and all their agents and employees from entering upon, fencing, watering stock at, fouling, or in any way interfering with the claimant's spring and the 40 rods around it, except by the claimant's express leave, pending final confirmation by the United States Land Office. Any man who violates this order will answer to me personally on my next circuit, and I assure you all I will not be in a generous frame of mind. He rapped the rail. Furthermore, the court directs the county attorney to look into the matter of the salting of the spring as a criminal trespass and malicious mischief, and I expect a report when I come back through in September. Mr. Vane, I'd think hard, were I you, about what's in those sacks and whose riders carried them before that report is written. Now, is there any other business this morning, or are we done? There was no other business. Court was done. Della Hartwell walked out of that hotel back room into the white morning light of Three Forks, a different woman than the one who had walked in, and the whole town saw it. The men on the mercantile porch who had watched her walk past in shame 2 weeks before now stood up. Dorsey, the storekeeper, who had refused her eggs, came down off his porch and crossed the street to her, hat in his hand, and said, "Mrs. Hartwell, about the eggs. I was a fool, and I let myself be leaned on, and I'm ashamed of it. Your eggs are good as gold in my store, and your credit's good too, anything you need, and I mean that." And Albert Dorr, the elder of the Dorr brothers, the thoughtful one, came and stood in front of her, and took off his hat, and said, "Mrs. Hartwell, my wife told me what you said in the street about sharing the water with the families. I'm ashamed it took a court for me to see it. We've been fighting Vane over that section for 2 years and bleeding for it, and you went and did the one thing none of us had the sense to do. You read the book." He put out his hand. "If your offer stands, if the honest families in this valley can come haul water from your spring in an orderly way, with your leave, then you've got the Dorr outfit behind you, and behind that order, against Vane or anybody else. You'll not be standing alone in that wash again." "It stands, Mr. Dorr," Della said, and she shook his hand, and that handshake was the moment the war turned for good, because the second biggest outfit in the valley had just crossed the line and put itself between the widow and Cyrus Vane. But here's the thing about a man like Cyrus Vane. A court order does not change his heart. It only changes his calculations. And Vane stood on the steps of that hotel and watched the town turn to the widow, and watched the Dorr outfit shake her hand, and watched 2 years of his ambition come apart, and a cold and ugly thing settled into him, and he was not finished. The law had beaten him in the daylight, so he would try one more time in the dark, bigger this time, and final. The drought broke that thing wide open because the drought got worse. The whole of late June was a furnace. The wind came off the mesas dry as an oven door. The seeps the outfits had been nursing went to cracked mud, and the cattle started to go down. The Dorr cattle were suffering, and the Keene cattle were dying, and even Vane's big outfit was hurting now, and the only live water in 40 miles was a widow's spring in the Sweetwater Wash, running cold and clear under a federal claim and a judge's order. And Della, and this is the part that turned the whole valley to her in the end, the thing that made her not just right, but loved. Della kept her word. She let the families come. Albert Dorr's men came first, in shifts, orderly, with her leave, and they did not come empty-handed. They brought flour and mended harness, and on the second day, Albert Dorr brought 4 men and a wagon of cut stone, and said, "Mrs. Hartwell, that pool of yours is doing the work of saving this valley, and it's held together with hope and flat rocks. Let my men build you a proper cofferdam. wall it in stone, deep enough to hold a real head of water so the stock can drink without trampling the source to mud. It's the least we owe the water, and you. And for 2 days, Doers, Hans, and Della worked side by side in the wash, setting stone and packing it, and they built a low, curved dam that backed the spring up into a clear, cold basin 3 feet deep, and a stone-lined channel below it to a long trough, so the cattle could come to the trough and drink without ever fouling the source. It was the first real infrastructure the spring had, and grateful men built it, and Della stood back at the end of the second day and looked at the walled basin, holding the evening sky, and could hardly speak. Old Harlan Keene was the hardest to come, because Keene was proud and old and had been Vane's bitter rival and the widow's enemy both, and it cost him to bend. But his cattle were dying, real animals bawling in the dust with their ribs showing, and a cattleman cannot watch that. And so on a blistering afternoon, Keene rode down into the wash himself, rather than send a hand. An old leather-faced man with a white mustache, and he got down off his horse and stood in front of the widow and turned his hat in his hands. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said gruff, hating every word, "I've said hard things about you. I rode with the men who wanted that section, and I'd be lying if I said I wasn't sore about how it fell out. But my stock's dying, and I'm too old and too poor in water to be proud about it. I'm asking, can my cattle drink?" And Della, who could have made him crawl for it after the things his outfit had said, did not make him crawl an inch. "Mr. Keene," she said, "bring your cattle down in the cool of the morning when the Doer stock isn't here, and water all you need. There's plenty for honest neighbors, and you're welcome to coffee while they drink." And the old man looked at her a long moment, this woman his whole class had tried to break, offering him coffee, and something went out of him, the old hardness, the soreness, and he said, quiet, "I had you figured wrong, missus. The whole valley had you figured wrong." And he came down every morning after that, and he did get his coffee, and the old hard man and the young widow would sit on the cofferdam wall in the cool dawn and watch his cattle drink and not say much. One of those mornings he turned his tin cup in his hands a while, and then he said gruff, "Your husband, he know about books and water and such like you?" "No," Della said. "Henry was a good man and a hard worker, but the letters never took with him. It was my father taught me, a recorder's clerk back in Missouri." Keene nodded slow at his cattle. "My boy could have used a mother who read," he said, which was as close as the old man ever came to telling her his own griefs. "He's gone now, years back. Fever. I'm sorry." "Long time," Keene said. He drank his coffee. Then, after a while, "You did a thing none of us did, missus, and then you handed it round to the men too proud to thank you proper. I won't forget it, whatever else this valley forgets." And that was the longest speech she ever got out of him, and it was one of the gentlest friendships in the whole of this. But it was the small family she gave the water freest of all, the homesteaders scratching at a quarter section with no big outfit to protect them, the Tuckers and a half-dozen like them. They came with their barrels and their few thin head, and Della never took a thing from them she could help, because she knew in her bones what it was to be the smallest one in the valley with no one at your back. Ada Tucker started coming early to help her, and the two young mothers would work the spring together in the morning cool with their children playing along the wash. And Sari Tucker, the 9-year-old, took to watching over little June like a big sister, and a kind of family grew up around that water that had nothing to do with deeds. Within 2 weeks, The widow's spring had become the thing that kept the whole valley alive through the worst of the drought, and the widow had become the person the whole valley owed. Everyone, that is, except Cyrus Vane, who had been too proud to ask and too angry to share, and who watched his rival's cattle and the homesteader's cattle drink from the spring he could not have, and curdled a little more every day he watched it. I was not there to see what passed between Vane and his range boss on the ranch in those last days of June, but Pete Sorrel told the most of it later, under oath, and I'll give it to you the way it came out, because you ought to understand that the worst thing in this story was not a man going mad. It was a man doing cold arithmetic and getting a monstrous answer. Sorrel said Vane called him up to the big house one evening near the end of the month, and they stood on the porch and watched the dust of the doer cattle moving down toward the wash to water. At the widow's spring, with the widow's leave, the thing Vane could see from his own porch and could not stop. And Vane said, low, not really to Sorrel, 2 years, Pete. 2 years I fought the doors and keened for that section, cut fence, buried a good horse, damn near got a man killed, and a widow with a shovel walks in and takes the water out from under all of us with a line in a book. He was quiet a while. Then he said, and now they thank her for it. You hear that? My own neighbors, hauling water with their hats in their hands, thanking the woman who beat me. Sorrel said there was something gone wrong in the boss's voice, a flatness. It's hers fair, boss, Sorrel said, careful, because he'd been at the spring and seen the water and the paper, and he was a hard man but not a liar. Filed and recorded and put to use, the judge said so, there's no taking it now. I know I can't take it, Vane said. And then he said the thing Sorrel said he'd never forget, the thing he repeated to the court word for word. But if I can't have it, Pete, then by God nobody's going to have it. Not the Doers, not Keene, not those scratch-poor nesters lining up at her trough, and not her. He turned and looked at his range boss in the dusk. A keg of powder set right down in the throat of that spring brings the whole red rock down on it, caves it, buries the source 40 foot deep, and then it's a dry wash again the way it was, the way everybody always said it was, and we're all back where we started, except the smart-mouth widows got nothing, and the Doers are hauling barrels from 40 miles again, same as me. Equal. He said it like it was reasonable. I'd rather we all had nothing than watch her hand it out like the queen of the valley. And Sorrel, and this is the one decent thing in his whole part of it, said, Boss, that's a spring. That's the only water in 40 Mile. You blow that, you don't just hurt her. You kill this whole country, the Tuckers, the little families, their stock. They'll have to pull out. People could die in a bad summer with no water and no spring. And Vane looked at him and said, Flat. Then they'll learn not to take what's mine. And Sorrel understood in that moment that his boss had gone somewhere a man should not go. And he should have walked off the ranch that night, and he has to live with the fact that he didn't, that he let himself be talked into riding down with the powder, telling himself he'd find a way to keep it from going too far. We'll see, before this is done, whether he found that way. So, on the night of the 2nd of July, Cyrus Vane made his last play, and it was the worst thing he ever did, and it was the thing that finished him. He sent men, 4 of them this time, his hardest riders, with Pete Sorrel leading them, down into the wash in the black of a moonless night, and they did not come to cut a fence or salt a pool. They came with shovels and a keg of black powder, and their purpose was to blow the spring, to set a charge down in the throat of it and collapse the whole thing, cave the cold welling source under tons of red rock, so that if Cyrus Vane could not have the water, then no one would have it, not the widow, not the Doers, not Keene, not the homesteaders, no one ever again. He would rather kill the only spring in 40 miles than watch it save the valley without him. That was the size of the man. But Della Hartwell was not alone in the wash anymore. That was Vane's miscalculation, the one he was too proud to see. Because the families came to water their stock now, the wash was watched. Albert Doyer, who had grown protective of the widow and her spring, had taken to sending a man to camp near it at night, ever since the salting, a quiet rider with a rifle named Tom Eccles. And Tom Eccles was awake and smoking in the rocks above the wash when he heard 4 horses come down in the dark, trying to be quiet and failing, and he saw the dull shine of a powder keg, and he did not need it explained to him. He fired 2 fast shots into the air to wake the wash and raise the alarm, and he sent his horse up the back trail at a dead run toward the Doyer place 2 miles off, and he yelled down into the dark as he went, in a voice that carried off the rocks, "Eccles to the widow! Vane's men at the spring with powder, rouse the valley," over and over, so that any soul within a mile would hear it and know. What Vane had not understood, what men like Vane never understand, is that when you spend 2 weeks letting thirsty neighbors water their dying cattle at your spring, asking nothing but honesty in return, you are not building a fence around your water. You are building something a fence cannot do. You are building a valley full of people who will come when you call. And they came. Tom Eccles' 2 shots and his shouting rolled up the wash and out across the dark country, and the country answered. At the Doyer place, a window went yellow, and then the porch, and Albert Doyer came out half-dressed already, throwing a saddle on a horse and roaring his brother and his hands awake, and in 3 minutes there were 5 Doyer riders pounding down the dark road toward the wash with rifles across their saddles. But it was not only the Doyers. Out at the poor Tucker quarter section, Eli Tucker had heard Eccles' shots roll across the flat. Sound carries a long way on a still desert night, and he'd heard, faint but clear off the rocks, the word powder and the word widow, and Eli Tucker did not stop to think about whether it was his fight. He thought about a young father with his hat in his hands, and a young widow who told him, "Bring your cow down and don't say another word about paying," and he was out of bed and onto his one old plow horse bareback with a shotgun in 20 seconds, and he was not the only homesteader who did it. Up and down the valley, in the little hard scrabble places that spring had kept alive, lamps came up and men came out, because the homesteaders knew exactly what that water meant to them and exactly what they owed the woman who'd shared it. Within 20 minutes, there were riders converging on the Sweetwater Wash from 3 directions in the dark. Door hands and Keene hands and dirt-poor nesters on plow horses, a dozen men and more, with rifles and shotguns and lanterns swinging, all of them riding hard through the black toward a widow's spring to defend it as if it were their own, because by now, in every way that mattered, it was. Della herself was already out of the brush shelter with the rifle, and the children pushed back up into the safe high rocks. And she stood at the head of her claim in the dark, and she heard the powder men cursing, heard Sorrel snarling at them to set the charge fast and ride, and she did the bravest thing she did in the whole of this, which was to walk down toward 4 armed men with a single-shot rifle and 1 shell, alone, into the dark, and call out, Pete Sorrel, I know your voice. There are a dozen guns coming down this wash right now, and if you light that powder, you will hang for it, because the judge put it in the record and the whole valley heard echoes name you. Put it down and ride, and you might still save your neck. And in the dark, Pete Sorrel, who could already hear the drum of a dozen horses coming, who could see lanterns bobbing down the wash from two directions, who was a hard man but not a stupid one, and not, in the end, a man willing to hang for Cyrus Vane's pride, made his decision for the second time in this story. He grabbed the keg back off the man who was setting it. He cursed Vane's name out loud, there in the dark, where his own men heard him do it, and he and the 4 riders broke and ran, scrambling onto their horses and lashing up the far slope and away into the night, just as the first of the doer riders thundered into the head of the wash with a lantern held high, and the spring was saved, and not one grain of black powder was lit, and Della Hartwell stood there in the dark with a dozen neighbors' horses milling around her in the lantern light, and a dozen neighbors' voices asking, was she all right? Were the children all right? What had happened? And she found that she was shaking too hard to answer, and Albert Doyer got down off his horse and steadied her by the shoulders, and she finally got the words out. They came to blow the spring so no one could have it. He'd rather kill it than let it live for the valley. And a low, ugly growl went round that circle of men in the dark, because every one of them understood now exactly the kind of man they had been calling neighbor, and exactly the kind of woman they had nearly let stand alone. That was the night the valley made its choice, and it did not choose Cyrus Vane. They stayed, most of them, until the dawn. Nobody much wanted to ride home in the dark after a thing like that, and besides, there was a feeling among them that they were not going to leave the widow and her babies alone in that wash again, not that night. They built the fire up, and they boiled coffee, and the men stood guard in shifts on the rims while the rest sat, and somewhere in the small hours it stopped being a posse and became something more like a gathering. Albert Doyer found the abandoned powder keg up the back trail at first light, where Sorrel's men had dropped it in their flight, and he carried it down into the firelight and set it in the middle of the circle, so every man could see the thing for what it was. And a long, ugly silence went round, because there is a difference between hearing a man tried to blow the spring and seeing the keg of powder he meant to do it with. And it was old Harlan Keene, of all people, who said the thing that settled it. The old man stood up by the fire, white mustache lit gold by the flames, and he looked at the keg, and he looked at the widow with her sleeping children, and he said, slow, in the gravelly voice of a man who'd been around since the country was new, I've ranched this valley 30 years. I've fought over water. I've done things I'm not proud of to hold a seep in a dry year, but I never once thought to destroy water so my neighbor couldn't have it. That's a thing past fighting. That's a thing against the country itself. He looked around the circle of tired men. This woman read the line none of us would read. She found the water none of us could find, and then she did the thing not one of us would have done. She shared it. With me, that called her a thief. With the Tuckers, that had nothing. With all of us. He set his jaw. I'm an old man, and I've got no use left for Cyrus Vane or his kind. From this morning, the Widow Spring is under the protection of every honest outfit in this valley, and any man who lifts a hand against it answers to the lot of us. Are we agreed? And the circle of men said they were agreed. A low rumble of yes that went all the way round the fire, Doyer hands and Keene hands and dirt-poor nesters alike, And Eli Tucker, sitting at the edge with his old shotgun across his knees, said his yes loudest of all. And Della Hartwell sat with her children sleeping against her, and the dawn coming gray over the rim, and listened to a whole valley swear to stand at her water, and she did not have a single word in her. She just held her babies and let the tears run and did not try to stop them, and not one of those hard men thought the less of her for it. That morning, before they rode home, Albert Dorr and Harlan Keene and Eli Tucker and 3 others walked the bounds of her 40 rods with her and set new stakes, deep ones, oak this time, cut with her name and the claim and the date. And they did it together, a whole valley driving her corners, so that the next man who pulled up the widow's stakes would be pulling up the will of every honest family in the country. It was the opposite of a fence cut in the dark. It was a line drawn in the daylight by neighbors, and it held. The end of it came quickly after that, the way these things do once the dam breaks. Tom Echols had named Sorrel, and Sorrel's men had been seen by a dozen witnesses, and the keg of powder was found abandoned up the back trail where they'd dropped it in their flight. And when the county attorney took the matter up, with Judge Pettibone's pointed instructions still ringing, the case against Vane built itself. Pete Sorrel, facing a charge that could hang him for the powder and knowing his boss would let him take the fall alone, did the sensible thing and told the whole truth in exchange for his own neck. The cut fences on Vane's order, the salt on Vane's order, the powder on Vane's order. It was all Vane. The Prescott lawyer Sewall, seeing the wreck coming, found urgent business elsewhere and stopped answering Vane's letters. And Cyrus Vane, who had ridden into this story as the richest and most powerful man in the county, found himself by the end of that summer facing criminal charges for the malicious destruction of a water source and the attempted destruction of another, charges that no amount of cattle could make go away, because Judge Pettibone had taken it personally, and Judge Pettibone did not forget. Vane was not hanged. The powder was never lit, and the law in the territory, slow and cold as it was, did not hang a man for a thing his rider stopped before it happened. But he was finished in that valley. You could see it the next time he came to town, and the town saw it too. He rode into Three Forks a few weeks after the powder night, the way he always had, expecting the street to make room for him the way it always had. And the street did not. Men he had bought drinks for turned and went into the store. A rancher he'd ridden the section wore beside crossed to the far boardwalk rather than meet him. And when Cyrus Vane stepped up onto the mercantile porch where he'd held court for 10 years and said something to the men gathered there, an easy remark about the weather, the kind of thing a powerful man says to start the morning's talk, not one of them answered him. They just looked at him, flat, the way decent people look at a man who has shamed himself, and then they went back to their own conversation as though he were not there at all. And Cyrus Vane, the richest man in the county, stood on that porch in a silence that was worse than any curse, and understood that he had become a man no decent person would stand beside. He turned his horse and rode out, and after that he came to town as little as he could. He was fined heavily and bound over to keep the peace, and this is the part that broke him. He was named publicly in open court in the record as the man who had tried to poison and then to blow up the only water in 40 miles rather than share it with his dying neighbors. The valley does not forgive that. The men who had ridden with him drifted away to other outfits. The town that had once jumped when he said don't trade with the widow now would not meet his eye. Within 2 years, he had sold his big spread for a fraction of its worth and gone north out of the territory, and the name Cyrus Vane became, in Three Forks, the thing you called a man who was too proud to ask and too small to share, a name for the worst kind of strength, the kind that would rather break a good thing than not own it. And the widow? In September, the answer came back from the United States Land Office in Prescott, and it confirmed everything. The reservation in the 71 survey was valid. The territorial statute permitted her claim. Her development to beneficial use was senior and good. The 40 rods of the Sweetwater Wash and the living spring at the heart of them belonged to Della Hartwell in her own name, free and clear, recorded in the books of the United States, world without end. A federal man rode down to look at it before the office made the patent final, a dry, careful man from Prescott named Mr. Halloran, with a leather case of papers and no particular warmth, the kind of man who has seen 100 frauds and expects 100 more, and little Sam, 7 years old and proud as a rooster, appointed himself the man's guide. He walked the federal man all around the claim, showing him everything, talking the whole way. "My mama dug it out with her own hands in a tin cup," the boy said. "It was buried under the sand. Everybody said it was dry, but my mama read the book, and the book said there was water, and she was right." He showed him the stone cofferdam the Dwyer men had built, and the trough, and the corner stakes the whole valley had driven, and the new grass, and Pearl the cow grown fat on it. And Mr. Halloran, who had come expecting to poke holes in a widow's story, found himself led around by a 7-year-old who knew exactly what beneficial use meant and why the stakes were oak and what the overflow channel did. And the dry, careful man began, in spite of himself, to thaw. He crouched and drank from the spring. He looked a long time at the green grass where the maps all said dead sand. He looked at the orderly way the Tucker family was watering their thin cattle at the trough, while Ada Tucker and the widow worked the basin together. And he wrote in his report, Della kept a copy of it the rest of her life, that the claimant had developed the reserved parcel to a standard of beneficial use exceeding any he had inspected in the territory, and that the claim was in all respects valid and meritorious, and ought to be confirmed without delay. Then he packed his leather case and shook the widow's hand, and as he mounted up, he looked down at Sam and said, "Gruff, you mind your mother, son. She's the smartest claimant I've met in 20 years on this job." And he rode north, and that was the last challenge anyone ever made to the widow's water. The line a dead surveyor had written in 1871, and a clerk had handed past 3 rich men, and a poor widow had read aloud in a crowded room, had held. It had held against money and cattle and 40 riders and salt and black powder and a paid Prescott lawyer, because that is what the written law is for, used exactly right, by a person too stubborn and too smart and too brave to be told to go home. I want to leave you in the wash, 2 years on, in the green of a wet spring after good rains, so you can see what one red line built. There is a proper stone-walled cistern at the spring now, and a long watering trough, and a fenced lane so stock can come to the water in an orderly way without trampling the source. And over it all a great old cottonwood that died when the water left and came back to life when the water returned, leafed out and whispering the way cottonwoods do, the surest sign of live water in that whole dry country. There is a snug stone house up on the bank, not large but tight and warm, built by the hands of grateful neighbors over 2 summers of work trade, the Dwyer men and the keen men and the homesteaders all haven't put a day or a week into it the way you do for someone who saved your cattle in a drought. And in the dooryard of that house, on the green morning I want to leave you with, there is a small herd of fat dun milk cows grazing the lush spring grass that grows now where there was only pale dead sand, and a flock of plump speckled hens scratching in the yard, and a pair of white nanny goats with their kids butting and playing at the edge of the water, all of them watered freely from the spring that a dead surveyor saw and a live widow saved. And there is Pearl, the old milk cow who was the only thing on Bitter Mesa still giving anything back in the worst of it, grown old and slow and fat and honored, lying in the shade by the trough, the founding mother of the whole enterprise, which in a way she is. And there is Della Hartwell, 28 now, brown and strong, her flaxen braid streaked a little lighter from the sun, kneeling at the lip of the spring with her sleeves rolled to the elbow, doing the thing she does first every single morning of her life, which is to clear any sand from the source with her bare hands and watch the cold, sweet water well up clear, the same way it welled up the first morning she dug for it alone with a tin cup and $3 to her name. Sam is 9 now and tall, watering the cows in the lane. June is 6, sitting on the cistern wall with a kid goat in her lap and her bare feet swinging over the water her mother won. And as the sun comes up gold over the red rock rim of the Sweetwater Wash and lights the dust and the green grass and the leafed-out cottonwood and the fat, contented animals and the strong brown woman at the spring, you would never guess, you would never in 1,000 years guess, that 2 years ago every soul in Three Forks said the same thing about her the morning she drove down off the mesa with $11 and 2 children and a rolled-up land record no one else had bothered to read. She won't hold a week. She held. She held everything, and the whole valley drinks from what she held to this day. If this story warmed you the way the spring warmed that valley, if you needed to be reminded that a quiet person who does the real work can outlast every loud person who only talks, then do me that one last kindness and let me know. Tap the like button so the next person finds this, and tell me down in the comments, where are you listening from today, and was there ever a moment in your own life when you read the line everyone else skipped and it changed everything? I read every one. Thank you for riding all the way down into the wash with me. I'll have another story for you soon, and a warm place by the fire waiting when you come back.